Do we finally have a lab test that can guide your choice of antidepressants based on more than just estimated cytochrome metabolic rates? Here's a new report suggesting that serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors like venlafaxine work better than a serotonin reuptake inhibitor like sertraline in patients with a high CRP level, C-reactive protein. But don't change your practice just yet. Let's have a look at this study and see whether its findings are strong enough to make you order a CRP level before shared decision making with your patient about which antidepressant to consider. Hi, Jim Phelps here for the Psychopharmacology Institute. First, do enough patients have high CRP levels to justify even looking for them? Well, yes. In this study of 918 patients, 23% had a level over 1 milligram per liter. Okay. Next step. How was works better defined? Oh, darn. They used the CGI, the Clinical Global Improvement Scale, not a very robust instrument. But before I go poking any more holes in this study, CRP measures inflammation, right? And inflammation is clearly connected to depression. So in the long run, this notion of CRP as an easy to measure indicator is very appealing. Indeed, this new article is not the first to suggest that CRP could be a useful biomarker. Remember the 2014 randomized trial in which patients with high CRP had better treatment outcomes with nortriptyline than with escitalopram? By contrast, this new study is simply a retrospective examination of patient records. As such, the authors had to control statistically for potential confounding factors like age, gender, anxiety, and other comorbidities, and in particular, obesity, which is associated with high CRP levels. You'll see that this statistical correction is crucial in interpreting the results. The main finding? In patients with a CRP less than 1, outcomes were the same, whether patients were treated with an SRI or an SNRI. But as reported in the abstract and in a prominent psychiatry newsletter, patients with a CRP of 1 or higher had better outcomes with SNRIs than SSRIs. This was true only after controlling for those confounding factors. And that was done using the Cox proportional hazards regression model, the details of which, even with a little Googling, are still beyond me, which is unfortunate because this result has huge clinical implications. Should we all start measuring CRP levels and recommend SNRIs rather than SRIs for patients with a CRP of 1 or higher? Well, on the other hand, you don't have to understand Cox regressions to recognize the difference between a randomized trial and a retrospective cohort study. And you don't have to be a research specialist to understand that the outcome measure used here, the Clinical Global Improvement Scale, calls for subjective judgments of improvement based on chart review, not direct patient interview, as with a Hamilton or Montgomery-Åsberg rating scale. And finally, we still have to ask, if the results were statistically significant, were they clinically significant? The p-value for the advantage of SNRIs over SSRIs in patients with a CRP of 1 or more was 0.037. Clinically significant? For that, I think you have to look at figure 2b, where it sure looks like a small difference to me, but you might detect some bias in my view. Why? Because I spend an awful lot of time tapering people off of antidepressants, and venlafaxine, as you have likely discovered, is among the hardest to discontinue. In my view, even with a robust difference in outcome, this study would still be insufficient to justify using SNRIs based on CRP because of its retrospective design and weak outcome measure. A better study on which to hang clinical decision-making would be the 2014 randomized trial, in which nortriptyline was favored over escitalopram in patients with high CRP levels. But that was nortriptyline, not venlafaxine, and the study was 12 weeks long, so like all of our short-term efficacy studies, doesn't give us insight into discontinuation withdrawal. Nevertheless, As the authors of this new paper review in their discussion, multiple studies have suggested that high CRP levels may predict some resistance to serotonergic antidepressants. Likewise, obesity clearly increases the likelihood of having a high CRP. So, before turning to venlafaxine or nortriptyline for patients with a high CRP, wouldn't logic suggest bupropion? That reminds me of a commentary from 2005, perhaps still relevant today and maybe even more so in the context of CRP levels. It was titled, "Why isn't bupropion the most frequently prescribed antidepressant?" Answer: clinicians believe bupropion could make anxiety worse. A 2008 review cited in that commentary does not support this belief. And for more, see the references. For now, to summarize, while the headlines and the abstract of this new retrospective study suggest that clinicians should obtain CRP levels and treat patients with a result of 1 or higher with an SNRI, the data are not sufficiently strong to justify turning to higher risk antidepressants on this basis alone. Nevertheless, watch for more on this issue because inflammation matters, and perhaps CRP can be a guide somehow.